groups. In this nugget, we discuss groups, and we specifically start off with domain functional level, and that's important because depending on the level of domain functional level that you can only have certain kinds of groups. And this particularly relates to whether or not you have NT4 domain controllers in the domain. Then we'll also take a look at the scope of the groups, and that means what a group can be a member of and what members can be within a group. We'll take a look also at trust relationships. Now, within a forest, the trusts are already created there automatically for you, but you may also need to create some manual trusts if you want to use users and groups from other domains that are not part of your forest. We'll take a look at Active Directory users and computers and how we can manage groups from within that common interface. And we'll look at also how we can convert groups. A group can be converted, for example, from universal to a global group, or many other types of conversions are also possible. But there are also some caveats and some things you have to look out for in order to make that conversion possible. And then we'll look at some command line utilities that allow you to manage groups. When it's time for me to go someplace with my kids, and they're all upstairs in our house, and I'm trying to get them all into the minivan, I'll just yell up the stairs and say, "Hey kids, it's time to go somewhere," and get in the minivan. Well, that's much easier than calling each individual one of their names, and it saves a little time, plus it saves me the embarrassment of sometimes forgetting their names. So that's what we use groups for, is to collectively apply to a number of different people at once. And that's the same thing we do in Active Directory. We use a group name that applies to multiple users. So for example, I can take something called the Phoenix Printers domain local group, and we'll explain what domain local, global, and universal groups are shortly here. But this is just one kind of group that I could have, and I could put a number of different people inside of this group so that when I then want to go to a printer and assign permissions to that printer, then I can go to the security tab and I can add just that one group. So I could use Phoenix Printers here, click OK, and then apply whatever permissions I wanted for them. And that, of course, would be much simpler than clicking on Add here and then just going through and choosing individual names one at a time through this interface. So the purpose of groups primarily is for ease of administration for you and me as administrators, because the users will probably never even know that they're in a group. I mean, they hardly ever call you up and say, "Hey, why don't you put me in that Phoenix Printers group or that Phoenix Administrators group or some other kind of a group." They don't even know. Now, when it comes to creating groups, however, you also have to be aware of what domain functional level your domain is in. The domain functional level, or DFL, can be one of 4 types, as you see here. And I hope you can read my writing today. It's a little cold, so my hands are kind of stiff. It's got to be, here in Phoenix, it's got to be, I don't know, 55 degrees or something like, so we're kind of in a cold snap here. And I'm sure you've got very sympathetic feelings for me in my cold snap over here. Anyway, with domain functional levels, or DFLs, we have 4 different types. The mixed would include NT4 domain controllers, Windows 2000, and Windows Server 2003 domain controllers. Now let's skip down here to this Windows Server 2003 interim, where you notice we also have NT4 domain controllers as well as Windows Server 2003 domain controllers. And a DFL refers only to what kind of domain controllers you have. It doesn't have any bearing on what your member servers are or what your workstations are. You can even have Macintosh and Linux machines in the mix in terms of your workstations and member servers, and it's not going to make a difference for DFL. And then we also have, like I was mentioning here, this NT4 factor. Anytime you have NT4 in the mix there with whatever your DFL is, you cannot have universal groups. So this is my big, no smoking sign over a universal group. So you cannot have universal groups with these 2 domain functional levels. Now, Windows 2000 native will include Windows 2000 and Windows Server 2003, and then the highest level of functionality is Windows Server 2003 DFL. Now, pretty much when you go from mixed or interim to native and then to Windows Server 2003, this is the highest domain functional level you can attain, and that not only allows you to have universal groups, but it also turns on certain other features that are available only within Windows Server 2003 DFL. Well, before we get too involved in the various kinds of groups and managing them and creating them and doing all kinds of other stuff, let's go ahead and take a look at the purpose and scope of a group. The scope of a group simply means what that group can be placed inside of and what you can place inside of that group. Of course, we generally think of putting users inside of groups, but you can also put one group inside of another, which is known as group nesting. First of all, let's take a look at the global group. The global group is very similar to what we've seen since the days of NT4, and you don't have to use it this way, but in general, administrators will create a global group to collect users of a common type. So maybe all users that have the same job function or same kinds of responsibilities. So I might put accountants in a global group, in the accounting global group. I might put graphic artists in the graphic artist global group, and so on. So then if we're here in nuggetlab.com and I've got a global group represented by this G in a circle here, then I could take my users of a common job type and put them inside of this global group. Then what can I do with that global group? Well, I can nest that global group inside of a domain local group, which is a very common use of global groups. I can also take that global group and nest it inside of yet another global group. And I can also take the global group and I can take that global group and nest it inside of a domain local group in another domain in my forest, or a trusted domain, or another universal group in another domain, again, in a trusted domain or in my forest. I cannot take my global group, however, and nest it inside of another global group in a different domain, only in another global group within my own domain. And just to round out the discussion of raising to a different domain functional level, if you're at one of the lower domain functional levels where you have, for example, NT4 domain controllers, and now you've upgraded them all to Windows Server 2003 or to Windows 2000, to upgrade that domain functional level, simply go to Active Directory Users and Computers, right-click, and then simply choose Raise Domain Functional Level. And you see that I've already raised mine to the highest possible level of Windows Server 2003. Otherwise, there will be a drop-down list available here for you to choose some other domain functional level. Now let me briefly tangent into a word that I've used here as well, forest and trust. When you configure domains like nuggetlab.com here and cbtnuggets.com over here, well, I can create my first domain in my organization, maybe nuggetlab.com. And if cbtnuggets.com is a subsidiary of my organization, and I want to have some common administration and management, and I want to be able to access resources back and forth between these domains, when I run DC promo to create a domain, my first domain controller over in cbtnuggets.com, I'll tell it to join an existing forest. And this will be a new tree in an existing forest. So then you could then have additional child domains over here, you know, phoenix.cbtnuggets.com. And over here I might also have another child domain in NuggetLab, maybe, you know, tucson.nuggetlab.com or something like that. Well, in a forest, all domains have a transitive trust one to the other. So there is no need to create manual trust relationships. And the trust relationships mean that I can take users from any domain and nest them inside of groups within my own domain, if I'm in nuggetlab.com, for example. Likewise, other domains can make use of my global group here, for example, or my users and nest them inside of their groups. And then likewise assign permissions to users and groups from within my domain. Now I also might create a trust relationship with some other domain out here. Maybe it's not somebody that we are directly responsible for, it's just whatever, you know, xyz.com domain you want out here. And we have users and groups out in their domain that maybe we've got a new partnership with and they need to access our resources as well. Well, we can create a trust with them such that we are the trusting domain and they are the trusted domain. We're doing the act of trusting and they are the trusted users and groups. That means that we can take their groups, whether it's global groups or universal groups or whatever, and their users, and nest them inside of our own groups, for example, and then we can assign permissions to them on our files, folders, and other resources such as printers. Likewise, they may decide to trust our users group and groups down here, and then they would become also a trusting domain, trusting our trusted users down here. And that would mean that we could then gain access to their resources if they assign permissions appropriately. Now, this kind of trust relationship would not be automatic, the way trust relationships would be within our own forest. No, in this kind of a situation, we would have to use Active Directory domains and trusts to configure the trust with this domain out here. Now, I covered global groups first for a reason, and that's because they have a dependence with domain local groups. Because remember, we usually take our users and we put them inside of Looks like this person's legs are disconnected. Sorry about that, little guy. Anyway, we take this person and we put them inside of our global group here, and then our global groups, remember, go into our domain local groups. Again, you don't have to do it that way, but that's kind of a general convention for administrators to follow. Now, in terms of the domain local groups, we normally make them resource-oriented. So I might have a domain local group that only applies to printers and plotters. So I might have a very expensive printer over here. I might have another very expensive printer over here. These are full-color laser printers that I only want my graphic artist users to be able to use. So I took my graphic artists, put them into this global group, and then I assigned the permissions to this domain local group called printers and plotters, and I assigned permissions on these printers and plotters to this domain local group. And then if I have another resource down here, something like a file share, that I also want to apply permissions to, then I can take another domain local group here, and let me just fill in another one. And I can again take this global group and put them into this domain local group and assign it permissions as well on this folder. Now the advantage of doing it this way, is of putting the global groups inside of my domain local groups, is that if I have to add another new user now to the global groups, I only have to make that addition one time into this global group, and I add them one time to this global group, and they are automatically assigned permissions as long as they've been nested properly into domain local groups. They've automatically been assigned permissions to this printer, to this plotter, to this folder, and any other resource that we have out there. And that way it prevents me from having to change group membership of individual little groups all over the place. I only change group membership once, and it's good for all of my domain local groups. Now you might have also seen something here that kind of begs a question. Why did I go through the intermediate step of not only creating the global group, but then nesting it in this domain local group and assigning permissions, and then nesting it inside of this domain local group and assigning permissions? Why not just create this global group here, scratch these domain local groups, and assign permissions directly from this global group to this printer, and to this printer, and to this folder? Well, it has to do with efficiency when I add additional users or groups to various permissions. For example, maybe I've got another global group down here, and this global group has users in it that are my marketing users. And the marketing users don't need to use these printers, but they do need to see the various flyers and posters and other advertising marketing materials that my graphic artists are creating up here. So what I can do is to take this global group and apply it to, or nest it inside of, this domain local group. Now once I've done that, they can see the contents of this folder as I assign them permissions appropriately. And then the real power comes in when I work with multiple domains, because I cannot take a domain local group and nest it inside of another domain local group. So that would be an impossible situation. Therefore, if I want these users to access resources in this domain, I'm going to have to take a global group and nest it inside of a domain local group. So that's one reason why I have to have domain local groups, because of the cross-domain nesting. Now I cannot take a global group and nest it inside of another global group over here. So that's the reason why I have to take global groups, nest them inside of domain local groups to give me the cross-domain functionality that I want. Now that having cleaned up, let me show you what nesting is possible with a domain local group. A domain local group can accept users from any domain, so any domain is possible here. That user or this user from over here. I can accept global group membership from its same domain, which is a very common practice, or any other domain, which is also very common and useful practice. I can accept universal group membership from any domain as well. And really, if you want an easy way to remember this, what you really look for is what it cannot do. It can do everything except a nested membership of a domain local group from another domain. This is not possible to nest this domain local group inside of this domain local group. That's really the only thing that it can't do. Now also, I really only address this from the perspective of the domain functional level of Windows 2000 native or Windows Server 2003. If I had NT4 domain controllers in the mix, then I would be in Windows 2000 mixed or Windows Server 2003 interim DFLs. And in that case, these so-called domain local groups would actually be local groups that exist only on domain controllers, and they can only be used to assign permissions on those domain controllers. If I had member servers or workstations, they would be blind to these so-called domain local groups, because in essence, they are really just local groups that exist only on domain controllers in a Windows 2000 mixed or Windows Server 2003 interim environment. And also with NT4 domain controllers in the mix, my global groups, likewise, can only contain user accounts, individual user accounts. They cannot have nested inside of them other groups. Now then, with universal groups, what we have is, first of all, no NT4 domain controllers at all. So we're going to be in Windows 2000 native or Windows Server 2003 domain functional level. With universal groups, our primary purpose in it is so that we can consolidate groups from multiple domains. So, for example, maybe I've got over here a child domain. Forgive my squiggly line there. And then in our child domain here, we have research.nuggetlab.com. And we want to assign permissions to resources in research.nuggetlab.com to users or groups from this domain and groups from this domain. So what we could do is to create a universal group down here and then nest inside of it the global groups from up here or another global group from over in this domain. And that way we can collect groups from multiple domains inside of this single universal group. Now also another thing we want to avoid is to take individual user accounts and put them inside of a universal group. Why is that? Because if you manage individual user accounts inside of a universal group, its membership gets updated in what's called the global catalog. The global catalog is a special domain controller that contains all the objects from all the domains within your forest. And when you change membership of the universal group, well, that universal group membership is contained in the global catalog, and then the global catalogs have to reflect that change back and forth through replication, one global catalog to the other. So, by changing your universal group membership on an individual user-by-user basis, you significantly increase your replication traffic between global catalogs. On the other hand, the global group, the fact that there is a global group is in the global catalog, but its individual membership on a user-by-user basis is not reflected in the global catalog. Therefore, I can change membership in my global groups quite easily without affecting replication traffic. And that wouldn't affect my global catalog to global catalog replication traffic. So we get great flexibility with universal groups because we can collect groups from multiple domains inside of a single universal group. Now, if you want to, you also have the flexibility of putting universal groups and nesting them inside of universal groups. But we don't do that quite as often. Normally, it's going to be global groups nested inside of universal groups. And again, the main purpose for that is to keep an eye on replication because you don't want to put individual users in universal groups so that you can avoid this unnecessary global catalog replication whenever possible. Now, what I just discussed was what a universal group can have as its members, and that was other universal groups as well as global groups, or individual accounts, of course, but that's not recommended. Now, having cleaned up here, let me show you what also can happen, and that is what universal groups can be members of. Universal groups can be members of course, other universal groups, and universal groups can be members of domain local groups. But the key thing to remember here is that a universal group cannot be a member of a global group. Now to create a group, I'll go to the OU of my choosing and right-click to choose New, and then Group. From here, I want to create a global group. Now remember, my global groups are generally according to responsibility or job function. So I might create this global group, and this might be my Tucson OU where I have my financial analysts, and all these users are financial analysts. So I might call them Global Finance. And that would be my global group. Now I can also make it a security group, which is what I'm going to be doing most of the time. And this allows me to assign permissions. Depending on your email application, I can also use a security group as a distribution group so that if I send an email to Global Finance, it is sent automatically to all the members of Global Finance. I can also make it a distribution group, which would mean that it's only useful for email distribution. But in our case, we'll just leave it as security and we'll go with this and click OK. Now I've also added a dlocal files here, which is a domain local group that I'll be using to assign permissions to a folder. And then I have universal all employees, which I'm going to use to also collect a global group from the cbtnuggets.com domain, which you haven't seen yet, but which I've already created. Now I want to add these users to the global finance group. So what I can do is to select them all, like you see I've done, right-click and choose Add to a Group. I can also go to the Global Finance group and double-click it, choose its members, of which there are none yet, click Add, and then from in this, I can add in the names. I can just add in the first few letters and click Check Names, and then it gives me the list of all of them that begin with that name. So I'll just select, maybe these users, and click OK. Now once I've added them in, I'll click OK again here, and now we see that they have group membership in the Global Finance group. Now then in my nesting principles of taking global groups, nesting them inside of domain local groups, I'll take my dlocal files here, and I can add as its membership my global group. So I'll add Global Finance here from the Tucson OU, into the dlocal files properties. Now once that's been done, on this domain-wide basis, I'm able to go to a resource such as the Tucson Financial folder, which has what appear to be several very important files in it. Hopefully nobody will see these. We don't want people in Phoenix to see the Phoenix staff reduction analysis so that they can see how much money they'll save if they get rid of us all. So we'll right-click here, and we'll choose Sharing and Security, and then we'll share the folder. First of all, we can share it with only members of a certain group if we want to, and we can remove everyone here. We'll look more at this kind of thing when we look at resource permissions later on. But for the time being, because of the sensitivity of the folder, I might just remove everyone and then instead add only the dlocal files group. Click OK here. And they're the only ones that I'll give, let's say, full control to. So I'll click OK. And then I would also even add additional security on the Security tab if I want by, again, adding that specific group and then becoming more granular in the kinds of permissions that I grant to that specific group. And again, we'll talk more about this kind of thing when we talk about resource access later on. And then to continue our discussion, I've got this universal group that I want all employees to be able to access. For example, maybe I've got a human resources folder of some kind that I want everybody to be able to always access, and I might want to apply that to users from my various domains so that they can fill out forms and so they can download documentation about their retirement plans and whatever. So here I've got the universal group, and I want to collect users from another domain. And DC Nugget 3 is a domain controller for cbtnuggets.com, where I have an organizational unit called Bisbee. Now, Bisbee may sound like a strange name to you. It's actually the name of an old southeast Arizona town where they did copper mining for years and years. In fact, if you have any old pennies in your pocket, chances are that the copper on that penny came from this mine down here in Bisbee, Arizona. It goes from 900 feet from top down to the bottom. I don't know if you can really see the scale there, but that's what it is. It doesn't actually get mined anymore. It's kind of historical now. In any case, Bisbee is where we've got a bunch of miners down here, Bisbee User 1 through Bisbee User 10, and we've added them all to the Global Miners group, which you can see if I go to the Members tab here. Now, this Global Miners Security group, I want to add to the Universal All Employees Security group so that I can grant permissions to this group eventually. Now offline here, I went ahead and created this dlocal public files, which I'm going to use to assign permissions to a folder. But before I do that, let me set up all my groups properly. First of all, the Universal All Employees group, I want to be able to make sure that I've got members in it from the Bisbee organizational unit. So I'm going to go to my select users, contacts, computers, or groups dialog box, select cbtnuggets.com, and enter in my global group there, if I can spell right. Okay, so I've got global miners from Bisbee. I also want to add in here, within our own domain, from nuggetlab.com, the accounting, or rather the finance groups. I'll go global finance here, and OK. And now I've got a couple of global groups inside of my universal group, which is a common practice. So then I'll OK this, and now that universal group is set. And then I would further nest that inside the dlocal public files folder here. So to add as its members, I would click on Add here, the universal group. And that's the Universal All Employees group. Then I'd click OK here, and OK. Now, this domain local group has as its member Universal All Employees, which has the Global Finance as well as my group from Bisbee, the Global Miners. Now, that might look like an awful lot of nesting, and in this kind of a domain structure, it might be. But if I had a deep domain structure where I had several child domains and all different kinds of domains involved, then it might be much more practical to use a universal security group. But you at least see the practical use of how you nest inside of it. In this implementation, I probably could have just as easily kept with some kind of a domain local group here and added just global finance as well as my global miners into the domain local public files security group and then assign permissions to this instead of to my universal group. And for our purposes, there's no solid, definite right answer. Either one would work just fine. So then I would simply go to the folder, in this case HR Info, right-click on it, Sharing and Security, and then I would share it as appropriate for that particular group. And I could just add here, since I'm using the universal group, the Universal All Employees, and then give them whatever kind of control they need. And this is, of course, is shared permissions. We could also define that more closely again with security permissions, as I discussed a moment ago. Now, you can also change the scope of a group. For example, my universal group here could be changed to a global group. Now, that would be no problem as long as there's not another universal group on the Members tab. So you see here there's no universal group. That would be fine. Now, why would that cause a problem if there was a universal group? Well, if I convert this to a global group, remember that a global group cannot have as its member a universal group. So it would create an impossible situation there. And in fact, the interface wouldn't let me do it. I would try to do it here, and I'd click apply, and it would bring up a dialog box with an error message on it saying that I could not have a global group with a universal group as its member. I can also convert this universal group to a domain local group, and there are no restrictions in the membership tab there. Now, kind of the converse of that would be to go to a global group and attempt to convert it to a universal group. And this is just fine as long as on the Member Of tab, it is not a member of another global group that we would have here. Since it's not in this case, I could go ahead and convert this. Now, really the easiest way to work with this is not to try to think of all the possible iterations of what you can do. It's kind of, in my opinion, and you can differ with me on this if you like, in my opinion, it's easier to think of what's not possible. Since I know that it's not possible for a universal group to be a member of a global group, then if there's a global group on the Member Of tab, I know that this would not be possible and I could not make this conversion. Now, I can also convert my domain local group to a universal group, provided that, once again, I'm not creating an impossible situation. Remember that a universal group cannot have, on its Members tab, a domain local group. So if I go to Members and there's a domain local group here, this would not be a possible conversion. Since there's no domain local group there, this would be just fine. Now, in addition to creating and modifying groups using the interface that we see here, we also need to be able to know how to do this from the command line. Again, from the command line, it's normally going to be more cumbersome than using the interface unless you need to import or export a whole batch of accounts at one time. So for groups, for example, it might be useful if you were to use a tool called LDIFDE to export, for example, a series of groups from one domain that you wanted to import into another domain. Now, they wouldn't have the same SID, they wouldn't have the same GUIDs, and they wouldn't have a lot of the same characteristics as the domain from which they came, but they would at least have the same name, the same account name, and so there might be some purpose or some usefulness in migrating those accounts over. Now, in reality, there are third-party products that make that kind of migration much easier, but if you're bare bones and you don't have any budget to purchase any third-party products to make that work, you can use something called LDIFDE. LDIFDE, and the syntax of this, is going to export to a file. The default behavior is to export, so I just specify which file I want it to go to, and that would be the export group.ldf file, which is on my C drive, and then I specify a distinguished name for it. And that's not really a distinguished name so much as it is a base distinguished name, so that it tells it where to start. I want it to look in the Phoenix OU and NuggetLab.com. I want it to go to the subtree level. And I'm looking for a category, and that's what the R here is. It's just a filter that says I want to look for a category of a group in this schema configuration naming context and NuggetLab.com. So, pause the screen if you need to take another look at that, because that is quite a lot of text, and of course you'll substitute your own organizational units and domain names as necessary. So then we'll just press enter. We'll see that it has exported these items to the file. So we'll go to the file called exportgroup.ldf, which is right here on my hard drive. I'll crack that open, and we see that it gives us information about these groups. Now, this makes for an interesting study in what the various types of information are that's included in an LDIF file. However, if you want to use this information to import and to import a group, the only thing you need to have are the distinguished name, the object class here that says object class group. Microsoft says you have to have change type add. The fact of the matter is you don't. You just have to have the distinguished name that I mentioned, object class group. Optionally, you can have membership. If you want to keep this membership, go ahead and leave that in the file. And then you also need a SAM account name. Technically, this is not a requirement, but if you don't enter in a SAM account name here, then it will enter in this random sequence of alphanumeric special character items here, and it just makes it a bunch of gibberish. And that's for your pre-Windows 2000 accounts. Might not make any difference unless you have pre-Windows 2000 requirements, and by that I mean NT4 specifically. So then closing export groups, let me go to import groups to clean it up a little bit and show you what I would need to do if I wanted to add a couple of groups to the Phoenix OU. The distinguished name here would be Phoenix admins. That's for my administrators to administer the servers and the users. And then in the OU of Phoenix, NuggetLab.com, it's a group, and my SAM account name is Phoenix Admins. I also need a help desk, and you can see down there what that looks like as well. So in order to import that, I would simply run ldiff, now with a -I to import so that it changes from its default behavior export. Looks for a file called importgroups.ldf. There's a -J to log any error messages that occur, and it will log them on the root of C in this case. I press enter. It modifies 2 entries successfully, it says, so I'll go to Active Directory Users and Computers, refresh the screen, and I see that it has now added in Phoenix Admins, and there's the pre-Windows 2000 name, or in other words, the SAM account name, and it's also added in the Phoenix Help Desk, and that's pretty much all there is to it. Now, another thing we can do to automate creation of accounts is to use our trusty little tool DSAdd. And again, I've gone to the Excel spreadsheet here, and you can find this on nuggetlab.com, where I've added yet another sheet here, groups. And in the groups, you see the syntax is pretty simple there. Just add in the name of the group that you want here, and then the DSAdd statement would be DSAdd group, followed by the distinguished name of whatever the name of the group is, followed by the type of scope. Scope, that looks like an I, but it's an L. L for domain local, G for global, and U for universal. And then I didn't put anything in here, but if you want to, you can also use a member of item, and that would simply be a dash member of, and then you enter in the distinguished name of whatever it is that you want it to be a member of, whatever other group you want it to be a member of. The thing to keep in mind there is that you, again, don't create any impossible group memberships. And then all I've done here is I've gone down here and I've created a concatenate statement again, concatenating B2 plus C2 plus D2. So that gives us the DSAdd statement plus the scope, and if you want to add a group membership, add that onto the end. I didn't have any, so there's nothing there. Simply selected all of that. Use the autofill handle to fill in all the rest of these, like you see I've already done. And then simply Control-C to copy this. Go to my creategroups.batch file, press Control-V to paste, and then we'll do a pause statement to make sure that everything works okay. We'll save this file. Now I'll double-click on it. We see that it's creating these groups. I'll press enter to continue. Didn't see any error messages. Go back to Active Directory where I'm in Phoenix, refresh the view of the organizational unit, and we see that sure enough there's Phoenix Admins, the global, the domain local. We have our 2 global groups and our universal group as expected. Now, if you want to know more syntax about DSAdd, just type in DSAdd and then group, user, or whatever else it is that you're trying to add. In our case, group, followed by a /question mark, and press enter. And that will give us the remaining syntax that's possible for this particular DSAdd group statement. For example, you can enter in additional credentials. You can enter in a SAM ID name for the group if you want. You can enter in, again, different credentials, especially if you're logged on with just generic domain user credentials and you need to enter in administrator credentials in order to create these groups. Now then here I've also entered in syntax that will allow you to change the group membership. So you can use dsmod to modify the group membership of, in this case, the Phoenix Managers group in the Phoenix OU in nuggetlab.com. And my modification that I want to make is to add a member. I can also remove a member using -RMMBR. And then in this case, add a member, and the user I'm adding in is Phoenix User 01. It kind of scrolls over to the side there, but I think you can see it. Phoenix User 01 in the organizational unit of Phoenix, nuggetlab.com. And again, you can use a spreadsheet or something like that. I think you see enough of the concatenate statement and all that kind of thing, and autofill, to be able to use this on your own now. But in any case, you just add in as many users as necessary, and in this case, I'll just enter in 1 to show you how it works. We'll press enter. We see that it's succeeded. So we'll go to Phoenix Managers here, double-click on it, and see its membership is indeed Phoenix User 01, and that's quite simply how you do it from the command line, and you can pause the screen if you like, and also look at online help for more about dsmod. Now, in a previous nugget, you saw me use dsquery user in order to be able to search for certain users and change some characteristics about that user account. You can do the same thing with dsquery group, and I can look for any group name that starts with PHX and then asterisk is my wildcard. And I can use this also not only to list the names that begin with PHX, which is what it would do if I stopped right there, but I've also decided to use the pipe symbol to pipe it out to the dsmod command to modify the group membership by adding a member. So I'm going to add the Phoenix User 10 user account to any group that starts with PHX. So I'll press enter here, and we see that it automatically adds Phoenix User 10 to all of these groups. And in fact, if I go to Phoenix User 10 and I double click on it, now I can see on its member of item here that it indeed added it to all of those groups. Likewise, I can go back into this and change the membership back by removing the membership. And for that, I would simply do the same syntax except for instead of add member, it would be rmmbr, or remove member. Press enter again. And now when I go to the user account once more, we see that indeed that membership is now absent and it's only a member of the default domain users group. Now also a handy way to get group membership for a specific group, in this case I'm just going to go to the normal administrators account that's already there by default, and that's the common name equals administrators in the built-in container in nuggetlab.com. All I want to do with dsgetGroup here is to find the membership for this administrators group. And that'll show me that the administrators group has as its members domain admins, enterprise admins, and the administrator account. Now then, if you want to use that in a printed form, you can also, again, send that out to, which is what this greater than symbol is, send that out to C:\\, and I just put admin group there. So if I go to my C drive and look for admin group, then I see this text file, which shows it to me in this format. And that would be useful if I further want to manipulate that through some kind of scripting or batch file language. Now I can also use dsget to find user membership so I can find out what groups a user is a member of. In this case, dsget user, I'm just looking for the administrator user account, not the group administrators, but the single administrator account in the distinguished name here with the member of parameter at the end. And I press enter, and I see immediately what groups this user is a member of. Now, this can be useful because, again, you can send this out to text file, and it's useful because instead of having to go to the property sheet for a number of different user accounts that you're trying to check on, you can put this in a batch file and send each one of these out to a text file so that you can identify them all and kind of collect them all in a more easy to manage location. Another thing I could do is to also expand the group membership. And in this case, I'll type in the exact same command, only I'll also put on the end a -expand. And what that does is it will tell me if any of these groups are also members of yet another group. And it doesn't connect the dots for you exactly, so some of this is a little bit of guesswork, but if I press enter here, I see that initially it looks pretty much the same, except that I also have this users item. Well, you see, domain users is a member of the built-in users group on this domain controller, so it shows me that one group is nested inside of another, and it gives me the full group membership all the way back. And this can also be useful in trying to trace down access problems so that you want to make sure that you know a user's membership in various groups so that you can see whether or not they've been granted specific access to a particular resource. In this nugget, we took a look at groups, and we started off with a discussion of the domain functional level, because that's important when you need to determine what kinds of groups you can create. For example, you can only use universal groups if there are no Windows NT 4 domain controllers in your environment, which would be something like a Windows Server 2003 interim environment or a Windows 2000 mixed domain functional level. We also took a look at the scope of your groups, what groups can be a member of other groups, and that's particularly called nesting, and what they can encompass in terms of their membership. And we also look at our trust relationships, which are automatically created in a forest, and which you can manually create as well if necessary. That allows you to borrow or to use users and groups from other domains. And we can also use Active Directory users and computers to manage those groups and to change their membership, as well as to convert those groups from one type of group scope to another. And then finally, we took at command line utilities to manage those groups. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.